What I said was the museum's great, and you folks made it that way. We have Scott and Mr. and Mrs. Scott Burroughs with us tonight. He is the police chief of our town. Where is he hiding? Stand up.
Well, yeah, you still.
So be careful what you do. With us also, a very famous historic figure, and you can tell it when you look at him. Greg Smith, direct descendant of the Duns, who were the first ranchers on this island. I believe he gets the ball like any cowboy. A really different kind of guest tonight. That's my wife had to do as she says. No one here in the area? And another very special guest tonight. We are blessed with Miss Reese Butler. Where is she? Did she stand up there? Come on, stand up there. Yes. Now that you clap and you can't take it back, she writes hot cowboy romances. And we still finished the book, and it's gonna, she'll have it. You can buy it from her. And wow, I don't know if I dare say this or not, but the subject is that back in the day up in Wyoming, in Montana, up in there, that part of the world, there were 3 cowboys for every lady. I didn't hear many men clapping. And so she wrote a novel about 3 cowboys and 1 lady. 9 cowboys and 1 lady? Yeah, I'm getting it on my head here. I would like to introduce you to the corporate secretary of the Porter Ranges Museum, Mr. PAPHA. Did he leave?
No, he's right here.
Come on up.
He wants you up there. Sorry.
He's shy.
A quorum being present, we will now induct new board members, Dr. Bill Behrens, Natalie Kaczynski, Carolyn Curley, Netta Adams, and Candace Terici. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
You got the wrong name, buddy. That's the right name.
No?
If you got the right ones, come on up.
Okay, let me, he's talking about new board members. Some of those names were appointed to fill an expired term. But the names, the nominees that we want to present to the membership for election for a 3-year term are Nancy Donnelly, Bill Behrens, Rick Pratt, Nancy Phillips, and Candace.
All right, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passed.
Man, what a professional crew. It's a little late to introduce Jim Moloney. He's the guy that just tells you spellbound with some of his 100 new postcards. If you were over, I know you were over at the museum. The postcards that you see on the wall are largely from his collection. We're a very unusual town in that we can tell our history in postcards because we've always been a tourist town. We started by offering to take people fishing. They showed up. We figured out they have to sleep somewhere, so we built hotels. They're going to be hungry, so we built restaurants. And maybe they have a little money and a little energy left over after eating and sleeping someone said, you know, there's some ladies coming here that aren't fishing, so we built shops. At the beach, and you've got the same port aransas that we've always had. So starting from the very beginning, when we came port aransas in 1910 to right now, we do the same thing that we've always done. Jim Moloney and Murphy Gibbons have written the book. It's, Jim is well known to all of us here locally because of his collecting. He's also a prominent businessman in Corpus Christi, Texas. Murphy Gibbons is the voice that you hear on the radio once a week when he does his historical column on the National Public Radio. And if you are a listener, as I am, you always hear something neat when Murphy Gibbons comes on the air, but he refuses to appear in public. So his representative is here tonight, Jim Moloney. We have with us tonight from Corpus Christi, Texas, Jim Moloney.
Now it's my mic. Okay, I published this book. The book is published by the Oasis Press. That's me. Can we kill lights? And 4 years ago, Murphy Gibbons and I got together and published our first book. And we both wrote it, the 1919 Storm. I did mostly the pictures, he did the writing. And we pretty much continued in that mode for the next 3 books. In this one, he did all the writing. I got to read it 4 or 5 times, looking for minor errors and things like AN instead of AND and things like that. But he did the bulk of the writing, all the writing. And what it is, it's a series. We wrote a book on the history of Corpus Christi, which is really the history of the area. And then we went through, and he went through and picked out some of his favorite stories about our local history and expanded on them into great tales. And when you grew up watching Westerns, either on television, in the movies, listening to them on the radio, you listened to stories about the Old West. Well, the stories were actually here in South Texas. They weren't in Wyoming or California. South Texas was the Wild West in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s. We had Mexican bandits, we had Indians, we had Texas Rangers, we had ranchers, we had widows. All the things that you saw on television, a lot of those stories were adapted out of the history of South Texas. If you've read Lone Star, much of that book is out of the history of South Texas. This is where the West began. We just seem to have forgotten it as we slowly but surely became modern cities and port cities. We forgot our roots were in the ranches and the South and the Badlands. So we go back to some of those tales to tell you about South Texas. Don't tell me this. Yeah, there we go. So we start out with Cabeza de Vaca. First European to set foot in Texas and live to talk about it. So he's the first. He was he was part of a group of explorers who went to Florida to find the Fountain of Youth and gold and whatever else they could find. And their ship left them there. They got separated from their ships and did not hook back up. So the men all built boats and sailed back to Mexico, and they ended up somewhere on the Gulf Coast in our area, probably St. Joseph's or Matagorda Island. And slowly but surely the Krakow Indians captured them all. Most of the men died. 4 of them survived, including Cabeza de Vaca. And they were slaves to the Indians. And eventually, Cabeza de Vaca developed this gift for healing the Indians of their ills. I don't know whether it was divine intervention or what, but he became known as a healer and became more respected by the Indians, and eventually they were allowed to wander and look for their way back. And so he eventually got up into northern Arizona, New Mexico, and then over to California. met up with the explorers over here on the west, near the west coast, and got back to Mexico City, and then went back to Spain. Eventually he became a governor in South America, but he wrote his memoirs about this trip. So he is the first European to record. He and his 3 companions were the ones that really came here first. And then the second group of people to come a few years later, about 27 years later, were, there we go, the 1554 Shipwreck Survivors. April 1554, the winds drove 3 ships onto Padre Island, down about where Port Mansfield is today, and sank them right at the edge of the beach. And everybody survived, and so they got off the boats, they got on the land, and eventually the Karancas started killing them. And they got down to, well, one guy was smart enough to go back to the wreckage and stay on the wreckage. And the other guy was shot up with arrows. He had 4 or 5 arrows in him, so his companions buried him, left his face out of the sand, but he didn't die. And so he actually was able to make it back to Mexico City. He was a friar, and tell the story of the shipwreck. And then the Spaniards came over the next spring to the wreckage to get the gold and silver that had been in the hulls, and they found the guy that was on the ships. And so those are the only 2 survivors out of probably 150 or 200 people on those boats. The wreckage, what's left of those ships, was salvaged in the 60s, and it's all the wreckage and all the artifacts are in the Corpus Christi Museum. So if you've not been to the museum, it's a great place to go to see the wreckage from that expedition. Whoops, way too many. LaSalle was the next European to show up, and he came in 1680s. He had discovered the mouth of the Mississippi River, and so he went back to France and convinced the French king to give him 4 boats and a bunch of helpers and come back to America to the mouth of the Mississippi and set up a settlement. Except he missed. And he ended up down somewhere around here. We're pretty sure he came as far as this area, but he ended up with his boats at Matagorda Bay, where one went back and the other 3 sank. I guess one never made it here. One went back and the other 2 sank. Stranding the colonists. They built a fort on the Garcitas Creek. His men did not like him. He was a very obnoxious leader, and they murdered him while they were walking back to Canada. But several of the men got back to Canada. The Spaniards got really excited because they found out from the Indians that there were Frenchmen in Texas. And so they came looking for the Frenchmen. They found the fort, and by further looking, they found 5 children who had survived, that the Indians had adopted as their own children. And so they the Spaniards rescued those 5 French children, 3 of which came back to Louisiana after they'd been taken back to Europe. So LaSalle was the reason that the Spaniards came to Texas. Before that, they had no use for this area that was dry with hostile Indians, and so they did not come until the French came, and then they had to start setting up their series of ranches and missions to keep the French out. Krakow Indians were here. They were not very nice Indians, big ones. Most of them were over 6 foot tall, the men. They were very, very crude and uncivilized. They spoke in a language of grunts and groans and shrieks rather than words. And they covered their bodies in alligator grease and petroleum tar that seeped out of the Gulf of Mexico. And they were cannibals. And if they caught a victim, they would actually, in some cases, tie them to a stake with a fire in front of them. And they would actually come up while their man was standing there and slice off a piece of his flesh and warm it in the fire and then eat it from it. Pretty disgusting, huh? Needless to say, they were wiped out. 1840s, the last band of Karancas was wiped out in Mexico, or they died out. Not sure whether I don't think they were killed. I think they just essentially stopped having children and died out. Big Foot Wallace is our next talk, and this is about the black bean incident. Each one of these people represents an incident in South Texas history. Big Foot Wallace fought in the Revolution, Texas Revolution. Then after Texas gained its independence from Mexico, Mexico did not recognize, first of all, didn't recognize us being independent. And second of all, they continued to claim the land all the way to the Nueces River. In 1842, there was a Mexican raid that came into Texas and captured San Antonio for 4 or 5 days. Came all the way down here to Old San Patricio and captured Fort La Ponte. So they then left, but the Texans in retaliation decided to go to Mexico and conquer one of their cities, which they did, and Wallace was part of that. But some of the men got greedy, and instead of coming home after capturing Mayer, they went further south to be able to get to more plunder. They were captured, they escaped, they were captured again, and the second time that they were captured, they decided they were going to kill them all. Santa Anna relented and allowed them to be decimated. One of every 10 was going to be executed. And so this is the famous black bean incident where they put 9 black beans and 9 white beans and 1 black bean. Actually, they put 150 in for the men, but 1/10 of them were black. And if you were unlucky enough to draw a black bean, you were killed. And Wallace was all part of that incident. He wrote about it, he talked about it, so we have that incident in the book. He actually survived. He was watching intently while they were putting the beans in, and he developed his own personal theory that the black beans were bigger than the white beans. So he put his hand in there and felt around until he found a small bean, and he probably was right because he drew a white one. Jack Hayes was a Texas Ranger, did not fight in the Texas Revolution. He was too young, but came over pretty much thereafter. He became an Indian fighter. In the Texas-Mexican War, he became commander of a battalion of Texas Rangers. Became noted for his bravery and his cunning, and would have become a general had the war lasted longer. Afterwards, he came back to Texas again and became a Texas Ranger for a few more years. He fought Comanches, and he is the first man to use, his group of Rangers all had the Colt 5 shooters, and turned the odds in favor of the Texans when they got those. Hayes, in 1849, got gold fever, went to California, stayed there, and died in the 1880s, but he was the mayor of Sacramento for a few years. We're going to talk more about Hayes and his 5 shooters when we get to the Comanches. Zachary Taylor came to South Texas, and this is primarily about Taylor's encampment in this area. Mexico had said that if the U.S. annexed Texas, that would be an act of war. So when they passed the resolution to annex Texas, Taylor and 3,500 troops came south to protect the Nueces Strip, and they settled in Corpus Christi for about 8 months. Then they decided to go back on further down to the Rio Grande Valley.
Is that an extra tall man or is it a small one?
Probably an extra small horse, and it's a drawing. Taylor actually became the President of the United States. I'm going to say something politically incorrect, but you don't care, do you? But in those days, they had the inauguration outdoors, and he spoke for about 2.5 hours in inclement weather in March, and he caught pneumonia and died a month after office. So I was wondering, why don't we do that today? I told you it would be politically incorrect. Daniel P. Whiting. We actually have a book by Daniel P. Whiting, which you'll have an opportunity to purchase after the meeting. Whiting is not famous or anything, but he drew 5 pictures of the Mexican War. And one of them was the picture of Corpus Christi with all the tents in 1845. So if he's famous, that's why he's famous. But he was part of the Mexican bomb. He was in the fort at Fort Texas when the Mexicans bombarded it for 7 days during the Mexican War. And so we have a chapter on the bombardment of Fort Brown. Fort Texas that became Fort Brown. Battery dying. There we go. My favorite character in the book, William P. Rogers. Young man, about 20 years old. He and his father, a couple brother-in-laws, and another 15 or 20 people were taking a load of goods to the Rio Grande Valley in 1846 to sell to the soldiers down there, going from Corpus Christi. They were ambushed by about 40 bandits in around the Arroyo, Colorado. And the bandits lined them all up and took their clothes off of them because they didn't want their clothes to get bloody or bullet-ridden. And they slit everybody's throat and threw them into a creek. The only one to survive was William P. Rogers. They cut his throat, but they didn't get his jugular vein. So he was able to survive for a couple days on berries and water, and he had to lay on his back to eat and drink. But he eventually made his way to a Mexican rancho down there, where a senorita and her father nursed him for a couple days and then turned him over to Mexican authorities, who in turn gave him back to the U.S. authorities, who in turn sent him home to Corpus Christi, where his mother nursed him back to health. And while he was nursing himself, getting nursed back to health, he learned Spanish and went back to that rancho and married the senorita. And see, this would make an awesome movie. And then he became a very successful businessman, became a state legislator, was a sheep rancher, became wealthy. But at age 55, he died of complications from a throat wound. But the really interesting part is that the 40 or so bandits that held them up, half of them were caught by Texas Rangers in Mexico and executed on the ranch. But the other 20 were still alive down along the Rio Grande. And Rogers and his brother would periodically go to the Rio Grande, and they would go to dances or fandangos, and they would seek out these guys. And one by one, each trip they would talk one guy out of a fandango to go outside. And outside he would get a knife to the heart and his throat slit. And he got everyone but one. One went into deep into Mexico where he could not be gotten by Rogers, but all the rest of them, it said that he got them all. And for many, many years in the Rio Grande, a cut throat was known as Billy's Mark. Great story. A little gruesome, but great. Camels. Jefferson Davis, you all know he was the president of the Confederacy, but in 1852, he was the Secretary of War for the United States. And he decided that we needed better transportation than steers and mules and oxen hauling equipment from the port of Indianola to the west. And so he had 2 shiploads of camels shipped to South Texas, where they proved extremely successful. They could carry 3 or 4 times the goods that a horse could. They didn't need as much water or food, but they smelled, they scared the horses, and the soldiers hated them. So even though they were better, they failed. And for many years, camels roamed wild camels roamed South Texas and New Mexico, and some of them survived into the 1870s. When U.S. Grant went south with Zachary Taylor from Corpus Christi to the valley, he wrote in his diary that they came across a herd of horses that was larger than the state of Rhode Island. Hundreds of thousands of horses. And There weren't many cows down here because the horses had control of the range. There weren't any buffalo down here either. So eventually those horses became a commodity, and men like J. Williams and Moses became Mustangers. And they would go out and they would round up portions of this gigantic herd and sell them off. And so there's a chapter on the Mustangers represented by Moses in the book, and how they did it, and so forth. One too many. Richard King is next, maybe? Too many. Richard King, you all know who he was. He founded the King Ranch. Came here as a boat captain during the Mexican War. In 1852, he came to Corpus Christi, where Kinney was holding a state fair. And on the way up, he saw that Wild Horse Desert. And he decided that that would make a great way to start building a ranch. And he went back to the valley and bought his first 20,000 acres for 2 cents an acre. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but the land was totally worthless. In the 1700s, the late 1700s, there were all of South Texas had been subdivided by the Mexicans. They had awarded fairly large land grants, and much of it was being ranched. But after Spain was defeated by the Mexicans, and Mexico became its own country, they lost interest in Texas and pulled their armies out, which in turn turned loose the Comanches and the Apaches. And so all those ranches became targets for plunder, and the ranchers were, if the ones that survived the first raid went back to Mexico, they did not stay in Texas. So all that land that had been nice ranches was totally useless and ungovernable and unmanageable. So Richard King, when he bought his first 20,000 acres, hired 50 men as his own personal army to keep track of it. So that's how it started to become valuable. Henry Kinney is you all know who he was. He was the founder of Corpus Christi. The more we read about him, the less I like him. Grew up in Pennsylvania, had to leave under difficult circumstances. He'd gotten into some kind of trouble, so he went to Illinois. From Illinois, he left with the payroll from the canal company he worked for, and came south to here first, to this area, and then went to Corpus Christi and set up a trading post to smuggle goods into Mexico. He convinced Zachary Taylor to come here in 1845, went with Taylor to Mexico and was a quartermaster, came back after the war and started selling off land. In 1852, he held a state fair, hoping to attract 20,000 acres and sell much of his land. Instead, he lost $50,000 and was bankrupt. And so he did what he always does, he took off. And he went to New York City and started raising money and men to go to Nicaragua and carve out a little kingdom in Nicaragua. When he got down there, he ran into another guy who was doing the same thing more successfully. So he came back in the late 1850s. And the last we hear of Kinney is in 1862, when he was leaving the home of his mistress, and he was shot by her husband and killed. Comanche Indians were probably, along with the Mongols, were the greatest horsemen that ever lived. The difference between them and the Mongols was the Comanches did not learn how to breed horses. So therefore, in order to keep horses, they had to steal them all the time. So they got very good at becoming fighters on horseback and riding. And a Comanche Indian in 1 minute could shoot 9 arrows while riding full speed. And we talked about Jack Hayes and the 6-shooters. In that 1 minute, it took a man who had just shot his long rifle to clean it out, put a new bullet in, and get it ready to shoot the second time. And to do that, he had to be standing up. So you're standing up for a minute while a Comanche's riding at you shooting 9 arrows. So you can imagine the surprise of the Indians the first time they ran into those Colt revolvers. And that started to make a difference. The Comanches actually held up the settlement of western Texas for over 100 years. And the thing that really finally did them in was there was a policy to wipe out the buffalo. And so they started, merchants started buying buffalo hides, and they started slaughtering the herds. And in about 5 years, all the buffalo and And that was the final draw that put the last of the